So today, as I think everyone knows, we're privileged to have as our guest a great friend of the North Dallas Chamber of Commerce and, frankly, an iconic figure in media in the state of Texas, Ross Ramsey. Ross is executive editor and co-founder of the Texas Tribune. And I'm not sure if everyone on this call knows exactly what the Texas Tribune is and what it does. So I'm going to read directly off of their website, which is a really great description of what they do. And what it says is, if I can find it here, it says, the Texas Tribune is the only member-supported, digital-first, nonpartisan media organization that informs Texans and engages with them about public policy, politics, government, and statewide issues. And I'm going to put in a little bit of a plug here because when I said they were member-supported, that means that they are a nonprofit. And they rely on contributions from their readers and other stakeholders to do the great work that they do. So the Texas Tribune, believe it or not, celebrated its 10th anniversary last year, which is just simply amazing to me that it's been in existence now for a decade and doing incredible work during all that time. Ross writes regularly, writes columns on politics, government, and public policy, and truly is one of the foremost authorities on the political landscape in Texas and beyond. He was formerly the editor and co-owner of Texas Weekly and also served a 2+ year stint in government with the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts. In the earlier stages of his career, he was a reporter for the Houston Chronicle and the Dallas Times-Herald and a freelancer for magazines, newspapers, and radio stations in Denton and Dallas. We talked yesterday about his stint at K-Box. Many of you more mature people on this call might remember K-Box and how prominent they were in the marketplace. While he's a native of El Paso and longtime resident of Austin, we here in North Texas can claim part of him as a native son since he attended the University of North Texas back in the late 70s, and we're really pleased to have him with us today. So welcome, Ross. We're glad you're here today, and we're really looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks for the introduction. It's funny to do a thing like this where you can see everybody's ceiling fan and wonder quietly to yourself how many of them are actually wearing dress pants.
Well, we actually have a program coming up later this week. It's called POP, and POP stands for Put On Your Pants, and it's designed to be a networking event, more or less just an opportunity for people to get together and catch up. But Ross, since we last saw you here in North Texas at a North Texas Commission lunch on March 2nd, the whole world has changed dramatically. Yeah. Tell us what you personally have been doing since March 2nd and how your world has changed.
Well, one of the things, that I'm sure I say it a lot in that appearance on March 2nd was we don't know until we've got an election in our lap exactly what the election is going to be about, and we have a classic example sitting right here. What was true on March 2nd was Trump is probably going to be one of the main subjects, but we don't know if we're going to be talking about the economy, if we're going to be talking about war, if we're going to be talking about something completely unforeseen. And here we are in something completely unforeseen. The next day after that speech was primary day. On the morning of the primaries, I filled the tank in my car, and that gasoline is still in it, unfortunately, because it's a lot cheaper now. And then we covered the primary elections, and my wife and I jumped on a plane and went to the UK. A couple of days in London, a few days in Edinburgh, a few more days in London. And what was interesting about that trip, and the only reason I bring it up is because we were getting texts and calls and emails from friends over here, and it was clear that, in Austin and in Texas and in the US, everybody was on DEFCON 8 or so. And it was also clear, we were part of, I guess, Boris Johnson's herd immunity experiment, that everybody in Britain was on DEFCON 2. So the anxiety level over here was way up here, and over there it was way down here. It escalated as we stayed over there, but they stayed in sort of normal mode the whole time we were there. We came back on the 16th of March. I had a fierce cold, and I'm pretty sure it was just a cold. It got me a fair amount of personal space on the airplane, I can say, and a lot of sideways glances. And when we landed in Atlanta, we got checked. You know, they did a CDC screening at the airport, and they took me aside because I'd been sneezing on the plane, and everybody's eyebrows were up, and said, "Hey, test that guy." They took my temperature, interviewed me, all of which was interesting as a reporter because I had a direct version of what they were asking, what they were looking for, what they were saying. They slapped a mask on me. They said, "You're fine to fly to Austin. We don't think you have this thing." They weren't doing testing much at that level, and said, "Stay in your house for 14 days. So since I got home on the 16th of March, you know, we did our 14 days. And I think I've been off of the lot that my house is on, certainly less than 10 times since March 16th. It's been a big change in everything that we do. But the rest of the world keeps going. I mean, all the things we talked about on March 2nd are still out there in front of us. And we're just trying to figure out, you know, how they look in a pandemic environment.
Yeah. So, Ross, when you left the country and the primary season had just ended, you know, we had a presumptive Democratic nominee for president. And I guess the first question we need to ask you is, does the general public today, does the electorate now, what do they think are they even thinking about this at all? Is this even important to them? And what's going to happen between now and the conventions and ultimately November at the federal level, looking at the presidential landscape?
You know, I think you have to divide politics into a couple of different pieces. You know, ordinarily you have the whole ballot, you know, 11 pages or whatever. And, you know, you might care about the president, you might care about your sheriff or whatever. Right now, all the attention is on the president and on the presidency broadly. So I think, you know, it's not going to be hard in a general sense for Joe Biden and Donald Trump to get attention. People are paying attention to Trump because of the actions that he's taking in the face of this, whether they like them or not. You know, their attention is on their leaders. To a certain extent, in Texas, our attention is on Greg Abbott, or on Clay Jenkins, or on Betsy Price, or Eric Johnson, you know, the people that are in charge. But what's interesting in each of those cases is that the rest of those governments kind of fade to gray. You're not paying as much attention in general to Congress or to the legislature or to a city council or a commissioner's court. It tends to be the executives that are running things right now. We used to have a thing we called in the newsroom Rick Perry County Commissioner mode. And it was whenever a tornado happened or a hurricane happened, Rick Perry would always, you know, slough off his coat, take off his tie, put on kind of a work shirt that said governor over here, where some work shirts say Texaco, and put on a ball cap and get to work. And he was really good at that mode of rolling up your sleeves. This isn't politics. This isn't party. This is just, let's get this thing fixed. And you see a lot of leaders kind of going into that gear, some of them not going into that gear, some of them kind of in a mix. But at the presidential level, you know, you're under high scrutiny. If you're going to have a press conference every day, if you're going to have a new proclamation or declaration or tweet every day, that to some extent is going to drive the conversation. And the fact that you have an opponent and a decision coming up for everybody in now less than 7 months, I think the presidential race is going to get plenty of attention. I think if you were running for U.S. Senate, whether you're John Cornyn seeking re-election or Royce West or MJ Hager, you know, trying to win a runoff to run against John Cornyn, it's going to be a hard time. You're going to have a hard time getting oxygen, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So what will be the impact of moving municipal elections in Texas to nonpartisan municipal elections to the November ballot?
You know, the first thing that changes whenever you do that, and I'm going to ignore the pandemic for a minute. When you move an election from a municipal date or a runoff date or something like that to a November date, you increase turnout tremendously. So if I'm a candidate who does particularly well when turnout is low, and that's how I've stayed on a school board or a city council or whatever, and I'm not a candidate who does particularly well if everybody shows up, this could be trouble. If I'm a populist candidate or I'm well known, I have some kind of celebrity, whether it's in business or sports or entertainment or whatever it is, I've got a name that people know, big election, it's probably good for me. So that's going to be case by case, but it's a completely different strategy and a completely different kind of an election. The other problem for those down ballot candidates, and the municipal and school board things are pretty well down the ballot, is that the presidential race is going to suck all the oxygen out of the room. And when you get to the first or second or third week of October, your chances of getting paid time on television in a TV commercial or something like that is going to be very difficult to get on, and it's going to be very expensive to get on. And if you're looking for coverage, what they call free media in the political world, people like me writing about you, the bandwidth that we have for writing about down ballot candidates, unless there's something peculiar, extraordinary, bizarre going on in the race, is really pretty limited. So our attention is going to be on the races that most people are paying attention to and want information about: presidential, U.S. Senate, particular congressional races, a couple of particular legislative races, and it thins out pretty quickly after that.
Yeah. So will we be voting, whether it be in these runoffs or in the actual November elections? Will we be voting by mail, electronically, or in person at the polls, or all of the above?
I think the practical answer to that is all of the above. We don't have the infrastructure in place for a complete vote by mail election in Texas, if that's what we wanted to do. You've got all of these voters out there, and if you send them all a ballot, first you have to print ballots. Who has printers anymore? You print ballots, you send them to them, you have some verification scheme, you have some counting scheme, you have to decide the date by which you have to have received a ballot in the mail. Do I have until election day at midnight to send in my ballot, or do you have to have it as a county registrar, for example, by midnight on, all of those kinds of questions. In some states, they've got 5 states now, I think is the number, that have universal vote by mail. My daughter lives in Washington State, and they mail them a ballot, and they fill out the ballot and mail it back or throw it in one of the boxes that you find around the cities in Washington. They've had vote by mail since 2005 and have had time to knock the kinks out. If you take a state like Texas, which is relatively limited in who can vote by mail, even if you changed your mind and changed the mind of everybody and said, okay, let's all vote by mail, the machinery is very difficult. So, the direct answer to your question is I don't think we can completely convert the state to a new system of voting by November. There are a bunch of lawsuits going right now from groups that say if you make the July runoff election in particular and the November general election possibly a choice between going to vote and getting sick, you're going to suppress some votes. You're going to get some people who don't go to vote. You're going to get some version of the Wisconsin experience from a couple of weeks ago. You've got a lot of problems with that. Right now, the political differences over voting by mail look like the Democrats want it and the Republicans don't. It's not completely that clean, but it's close enough for government work, and it's being litigated in the courts. The longer it takes in the courts, whether you end up with vote by mail or not, the longer it takes, the less time you have to set up all of the machinery that you need in order to pull it off.
So, Ross, we at the North Dallas Chamber of Commerce, we're very attuned to what's happening from an economic recovery perspective,
right,
at the region and the county and the local level here. But tell us what you're hearing from the governor's perspective, and what will Texas open, and when will that be happening?
In about an hour and 50 minutes, the governor's going to have another news conference to talk about exactly that question. So I wish I knew exactly what he was going to say, but he's basically said, look, we want to open things as soon as it's safe to open things. And he said, I'm going to take advice. This was in a Friday news conference, the last time he talked about it. I'm going to take advice from my medical people and open things with their advice as quickly as we can open them. There are a number of problems, and I know, a lot of you have read a lot about this. There are, you have to have enough testing that you're comfortable with where the virus is, who has it, who doesn't have it, who might be carrying it, and who can go into a restaurant or not go into a restaurant. I mean, when you get down to brass tacks, who can walk into a store? Who do you feel, purely in a medical sense or in a pandemic sense, who's safe and who's not? And those are keys to being able to open places. I think he would like to reopen the economy. A lot of people would like to reopen the economy. Glenn Hager, the Comptroller of Public Accounts, has already told lawmakers that he is going to revise his revenue estimate. That's his official forecast on how much money is available for the current budget, downward by billions and billions of dollars, kind of a Carl Sagan version. He didn't put a direct number on it, in mid-July. And he says, look, sales were down enough in March that we know we're in for a big hit. This week, every one of you who fills out a sales tax form mailed one in this week, and that's going to give us the March sales numbers. And those are going to be bad compared to the February numbers, but they're also going to be incomplete because the first half of March was, relatively okay until they started closing restaurants in the middle of the month. The May report is going to be a full month of pandemic, about April. Hager wants to watch that one. He wants to watch franchise taxes that also are due May 15th. In June, he'll get a good hard look at the numbers. And in July, here comes his revision of how things are going. The faster the governor can open things, or that the state can open things, or that various cities can open things, the faster you have at least a chance that those numbers will improve. The other thing you got to weigh against all of this is, what the governor says we can do is only one component of what we feel comfortable doing. I also want to ask my doctor. I want to see what the medical experts are saying, independently of whether my favorite restaurant is open to sit down in or for takeout or whatever. And I think there's going to be probably some reluctance among, in the public about going back to places where they're not sure they're not in danger.
Yeah. Well, we're looking forward to hearing the governor's remarks and seeing what kind of progress is being made on that front. So this is going to be my last question. I want everybody, well, before I go there, we were talking about voting a little bit earlier and some of the challenges on the voting front. Ruben Esquivel asked the question, a very simple question. What do you think, Ross, is going to be the impact of not having straight party voting in November?
A couple of things. One of them is a little bit counterintuitive, but I think the first thing is a lot of people, you can still vote a straight ticket, but you have to go one by one down the ballot. I can vote for every Republican on the ballot. It's just going to take a while. There was a picture. I love this image. There was an assistant clerk in the Harris County Clerk's office in the last election in 2018 who tweeted a picture of herself holding the Harris County ballot. She had her hand up like this above her head, and the ballot unfurled all the way to the floor and then folded up on the floor. And she said, "I'm 5'9". This is the Harris County ballot." A lot of the heavy smokers are never going to make it to the bottom of that ballot. If you can vote a straight ticket and just put, R or D or Libertarian or Green at the top and then go home, that's a different proposition from going check, 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 check. If there's a big turnout in an election without a straight ticket ballot, it means your average time in the booth is going to be longer. That's going to slow the lines up. That all kind of triggers back. Classic traffic jam. The counterintuitive part of this is if you are in a relatively small interest group, you have a great deal of influence over the races at the bottom of the ticket, because the numbers are going to be small in those races. And with a smaller lift, I can actually move some votes. I can move enough votes to probably win a JP race or a constable race, maybe even a sheriff's race or a county commissioner race, in a way that I couldn't necessarily if it was a straight ticket. You guys all remember, every county in Texas has a version of that time when the county was in a bad mood and it flipped a whole courthouse. it's going to be easier to control those flips. And, you know, I think some of the people that were in favor of getting rid of straight ticket voting, they were mostly Republicans this time, had just gone through courthouse flips in, you know, Dallas a little while ago, more recently in Harris County, and, you know, wanted to see if they could protect some of those mid-ballot and lower ballot people from their party.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Sure.
So, Ross, this is going to be my last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Kittner for some questions as well as the audience. And again, feel free to post your question in the chat function. We'll call on you to ask your question, so don't hesitate to let us know what's going on. So, Ross, you know, a lot's at stake in the 87th legislative session, not the least of which is the use of the rainy day fund post-pandemic, property taxes, healthcare, redistricting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So can you give us just a mini preview of what we might expect to be occurring next year at this time? And or will the pandemic suck all the air out of the room?
You know, there's the easiest, most honest answer to that is I don't know. But there are a lot of things you can guess at. You know that the legislature was going into a touchy budget even before the pandemic and even before what happened in oil over the weekend and yesterday. And the problem with it was that they have X amount of money coming in, but in the last 4 or 5 years, they've made 2 big commitments. Voters made one of them in the form of the constitutional amendment. You may remember this, it passed pretty easily, that moves a bunch of money, new money from sales tax revenues directly to transportation and moves them past the discretionary part of the budget. So a lot of the growing economy feeds transportation and doesn't feed the rest of the budget. So there's a commitment there. And, you know, a shrinking of the legislature's ability to fiddle with the things in the budget. And then in the last legislative session, in their effort to shore up school finance and to answer a pretty loud, pretty consistent public cry for the state to increase its share of public education spending and to decrease, to the extent that it could, the reliance on local property taxes for public schools, they made some commitments to public education that a lot of legislators are sort of looking over their glasses about and wondering, are we going to be able to afford this? That was before the pandemic and before oil. So they had a kind of a tight budget going in. So I think with the prospect of Glenn Hager coming in and reducing your revenue by billions and billions of dollars on top of that, I think you're going to have a very tough budget. Last time we did this was after the 2008 crunch. We had a crunch in the 2009 session, another one in 2011. You can't cut very much money from the Texas budget without getting into health and human services and public education. Those are the 2 biggest components. We don't know at this moment what public education is going to look like. Are they going to let the kids back in schools in August and September? Are we going to go another semester online? What are our cost commitments? What is that? You know, how does that work? There's a whole lot of questions involved with that. There are a lot of questions involved with higher education. I was talking to somebody yesterday, fairly high level at University of North Texas, my alma mater. And they were talking about in the next few weeks, they're going to make a decision about whether classes are live or online in the fall semester. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on. It's going to determine how the budget is. So budget's going to be one big component of the next session. Redistricting is always a big component. One of the things the Trump administration is talking about, they haven't pulled the trigger yet, but I think they're going to, is delaying the census by 3 months. The practical version of this is you got your census form in the mail. I think the number for Texas was 43% or so answered that. And the way they fill that out is they go door to door. I remember my mom doing it back in 1970. They go door to door, bang on the door. How many humans are in this building? You know, all of that kind of stuff. But that's hard in the time of coronavirus. So they're pushing that back 3 months, pushing back delivery of the census for 3 months, pushing back legislative consideration of redistricting, which depends on that new census, 3 months, and, you know, messing with all of the machinery of that. If you take a redistricting thing to a legislature or a commissioner's court or a city council, and say, we want you to redraw the lines with which you yourself were elected. You get into a whole realm of politics that, only pops up when you're doing redistricting. They're completely distracted by it. It's, it's politically existential behavior. You're trying to figure out if I can draw a district that I can get elected from that'll also get through the courts. It's a huge distraction at the very least. And then you've got all the normal things that are going on in a regular legislative session. Are we going to continue the skirmishes and battles we've had between local government and state government? What are we going to do with taxes in the face of that budget and in the face of, dents to sales taxes, dents to property taxes that are going to come certainly first in the Permian Basin, but, wherever there's oil, and then maybe through the state. All of the ramifications of the economic things that are going on right now are going to show up in that session, and I think are going to color the elections and the session that follows.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Jeff, I know you've got several questions that you'd like to pose. So Jeff Kittner.
Sure. Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Ross. On the topic of the mechanics of elections, Ross, what are your thoughts on where the municipal elections should be? Should they be in November, or should they take place in May? We've had an ongoing debate up here amongst the chamber and other elected officials about when is the right time for municipal elections, and there's pros and cons for both. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
I don't really have a recommendation, but you have to know when you're making that decision that you're making a decision that's going to affect who's on your, city council or, your school board or whatever it is you're moving from May to November. Some places have November elections all the time. Houston City Council and the mayor are elected in November elections. The real difference between a November and a May election is turnout and how many people are going to show up. And are you a candidate, or are you from a party that does better with a higher or lower turnout? And, from where I stand, that seems to color everybody's position. You can almost tell it's not 100%, but if somebody's arguing for May, my bet is that they do better, or their party does better, or the things that they are worried about do better in a lower turnout election in May. Another argument is that, this oxygen argument that I was making a minute ago. If I'm running for city council, I can get, at least theoretically, more attention in April and May without, competing with Joe Biden and Donald Trump for attention than I can get in November. In November, I'm going to be on that, on the 6th page or the 7th page or the 8th page of a long, long ballot. In May, I might be on the 3rd page. So, those are the things that are in contention when you do those elections. One of the arguments that the people who like vote by mail, and I'll broaden this past Texas so we're kind of out of the partisan fight for a minute. In states that have vote by mail, this is a little bit easier because you've eased the process of voting so much that your turnout equalizes a little bit. And, one election or another, is less, I don't have to go down to the library and stand in line, twice a year. I just have to fill out a thing in an envelope.
Yep.
Thanks. A related question that came up from Tina Young from Market Wave. Tina, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, and Ross, you really addressed some of the mail-in ballots, but I was just thinking with regard to the potential kind of fears around a virus rebound type of situation.
Right.
I know things are maybe held up in legislation right now, but I wondered if you thought that Texas may move in a bigger wave towards that based on the rebound fears.
When we get to the regular legislative session in January, we'll have 2 elections under our belt, and we'll be able to look at what happened electorally and medically in the July 14th election and the run up to that. That's a lower turnout election. It's the runoffs, but there's a Senate race in there and some other things, and in the November election. And you don't know from here exactly what the intersection of coronavirus and elections is going to be certainly in November. It may be that we have a handle on this and that voting is more or less normal. It may be that we don't. July is a little bit more, worrisome and troublesome. And, the conversation about whether to change this or not, Texas has a fairly restrictive vote by mail system. It's absentee. You have to say or swear that you're either going to be out of county on election day, that you're disabled or sick, that you're over 65. And the question that they're arguing in court is a contention that the coronavirus makes all of us potentially disabled for purposes of going to the polls, that it would cause us danger and potential harm to go to the polls. I'll leave that to the courts, but it's not going to be a legislative matter, I don't think, until after these two elections. So the legislature is probably not going to come back until January.
Okay, thank you.
Ross, you mentioned some of the July elections that are coming up. Can you talk about how the July election may impact some of these primary runoff races, such as the Democratic nomination for the U.S. Senate seat?
The problem is going to be where is, other than the problem of voting in midsummer, which is always, if you just had a clean layout, we had a clean calendar, we didn't have a pandemic, we didn't have any economic troubles, we just were going into a regular election year, kind of humming along, doing our regular thing. Mid-July is a tough time to have an election. You got to get people to, stop going to Six Flags for a minute and, calm the kids in the backseat of the van. And it's a hard time to have an election, and it's a runoff election. And those two things combine to make it a relatively low turnout affair. And again, you're into the kind of politics where you're saying, do I do better in a low turnout, in a larger turnout? If I'm running for Senate and I'm, MJ Hager or Royce West, there's some advantage in small numbers. I can usually get a pretty good read on which voters are certainly going to vote in a lower turnout election, and I can target my marketing to those people and not to the vast number of registered voters who are, low probability voters. So you got a little bit of help there. You're going to have to compete with the coronavirus. If it's not a medical question, it's certainly going to be an attention question. We've got in politics right now, we've got sort of a mass attention deficit disorder because we're paying attention just to one thing. And if your politics are not that one thing, you're on the back burner. I think the candidates are going to have a hard time turning people out, but it'll vary. I think, Royce West will get a turnout in parts of Dallas. MJ Hager will get a turnout in parts of Central Texas, and they might be able to overcome with their regional strengths whatever goes on in Houston and San Antonio and El Paso and Fort Worth and some of the other places like that.
So, hey, Ross, let's back up for a second. Let's just ask some real basic questions that I think everybody's real interested in. Can Joe Biden defeat Donald Trump in Texas? And then secondly, is John Cornyn at risk at all from your perspective?
If you just take the baseline, I would say no and no. This is still a red state. In the 2018 election, the Democrats made some real strides. They had a really, really good year, which is not completely unexpected. Presidents, with a few exceptions, presidents generally have a lousy time in their first midterm. It happened to, Ronald Reagan. It happened to Bill Clinton. It didn't happen to George W. Bush, but he was, coming off of the 9/11 disaster, and the country rallied around him. Barack Obama had a terrible first midterm that's called the Tea Party year. So that Donald Trump had a bad time in 2018 is historically unsurprising. But even in a really good year, when their turnout was really, really high and they did better than they've done in a couple of decades, the Democrats fell short in all the statewide races. So you've got to say, that was closer, and the Democrats have some reason for hope. The Republicans have some reason for fear, but your baseline is still that this is a red state and the Democrats still haven't topped the hill. Then you put in all of the variables from the year. Does Donald Trump come out of or enter the election, the real election season, the 3 or 4 or 5 weeks before the November election, in good shape or bad shape, politically, economically, medically. I'm not talking about his personal health. I'm talking about the country's health. Where's coronavirus? Are the kids still at home? All of those kinds of things are going to color this election and are going to play into the idea that, every re-election is a referendum on what you think of the incumbent. And if all of those things are going better for Trump, Joe Biden's going to have a very hard time. And, if they're going really, really badly, you might get to throw out the bum year. John Cornyn's problem is a little bit different. In 2018, Ted Cruz we did two polls. We did a poll kind of at the beginning of Ted Cruz's race, and the race was unexpectedly close. Ted Cruz was here and Beto O'Rourke was here, and it was unexpectedly close. But then you looked at the numbers for, do you know who Beto O'Rourke is? And 58% of Texans didn't have any idea who he was. So the first race was really Ted Cruz versus not Ted Cruz. It was kind of a referendum on Ted Cruz. And as the race closed up and Beto O'Rourke's name ID went up and Ted Cruz's stayed high, the race closed a little bit, but it remained really a referendum on Ted Cruz. And if you look at his numbers, it's clear that the people who like him in Texas really, really like him. And the people who don't like him in Texas really, really don't like him. And he had just come off of a presidential race. Name ID was through the ceiling. A peculiar kind of a candidacy. Cornyn, on the other hand, has been in office longer. I think I'd have to go back and check. I think this is his 7th statewide election. He was on the state Supreme Court. He was Attorney General. He's been in the U.S. Senate. So he's been on the ballot for a long time. He's a well-known name, but the intensity of feeling toward him is much, much lighter than it is for Cruz. The people that don't like him aren't as numerous. The people who do like him aren't as numerous. And the people who are sort of like, yeah, he's all right, are, almost a third of the electorate. So the Democrat in that race doesn't enter with the built-in advantage of a bunch of people who are ticked off at the incumbent. Again, though, Cornyn is going to be dependent on how people are feeling about the way the economic times have been handled, the way the pandemic has been handled, and what's going on in October when we all go in to pull the lever.
Yeah.
Ross, you mentioned that we're still a red state right now. Where do you see Texas 5-10 years from now? At some point, do you see a shift to Texas becoming a more blue state, or at least a purple state, or is that longer term?
It's getting more competitive. The margins have closed a little bit. There was a period of time where the average distance between a statewide Republican and a statewide Democrat on general election day was 15 to 20 points. A couple of them were 22-point races. The Democrats were kind of at their nadir. I'm old enough to remember when it was the other way around, and you couldn't get a Republican into statewide office unless maybe his name was John Tower, and every once in a while Bill Clements. Nobody else could bust through, and then the thing flipped. The major metros have flipped for the most part. Dallas is blue. Houston is, if it's still purple, it's pretty blue purple. San Antonio and Austin are blue. El Paso's blue. If you look at the triangle of Dallas-Fort Worth down to Austin, San Antonio, and over to Houston, that's where most of the state's population is, and the metros in that area are blue. But there are a lot of people out there in the red part of the state, and there are a fair number of Republicans even in the blue part. What changed in 2018, and it's a single data point, so I don't know that it's a trend, was that the Republican suburbs, places like Denton and Collin and Rockwall up in your area, Williamson County down here, Montgomery County, were not as reliably red as they have been in the past. And that cost a lot of Republicans a lot of votes. That's why there were so many flips in the congressional delegation, so many flips in the, so many unexpected results in the Texas House of Representatives and so on. Whether that continues is going to be one of the questions of the 2020 election. And you never get a perfect lab experiment. If we had a nice flat year without a coronavirus and the economy was banging along, we'd get a really pretty lab experiment. We could compare 2018 to 2020. But what 2020 is beginning to look like from this distance, and this, this could easily change. It changed from the last time you saw me, is this has become about something else. This isn't just a normal election year. This is about how did we respond to a pandemic that as of today has killed 45,000 Americans, to an economic crunch that, in particular in Texas, we're really feeling. I was talking to a friend of mine who's an economist. Some of you know Dale Kramer at the Texas Taxpayers Association. And I asked him what the oil thing meant. And he said, well, I got all the training, but I didn't know a commodity could have a price drop of more than 100%. I guess I stand corrected. All of those things kind of mess it up and make this increase the level of uncertainty of everybody in politics as well as in business.
Ross, you talked about the down ballot effect.
Right.
You hit on this in your previous answer, but drill down a little bit about, we had the Beto effect in the last cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And it had a profound impact at the House, as well as some in the Senate. But the question is there a potential Beto effect in this November election, based on the response you already had, without the name recognition, with talking about an up ballot being Biden and or Hager or West? What do you see happening there down ballot?
I think in a year when the presidential contest is actually on the ballot, that's the wind. Everything else is wheat. We just sort of blow in the wind to some extent. And you see candidates, you can watch how the presidents are doing, in a sideways way by watching what the candidates underneath are doing. Are the Republicans backing the president or taking their distance? You may remember in the 2012 election, a lot of Democrats in places like Texas and conservative states were saying, I like Barack Obama just as soon he didn't show up in my district. If you see people running toward their top of the ticket person in a presidential year, that kind of tells you how things are going. See them running away, that kind of tells you how things are going. So the first most important thing is, how's your presidential candidate doing? That's going to be the most kind of important variable. And then, all the regular things apply. Do you have enough money to advertise? Have you done anything stupid? Has your opponent done anything stupid? Have you become news in a good way or a bad way? And how far down the ballot are you? I think that's going to be a real factor this time. So you walk into the booth. I'll make up a scenario. I don't know that I will defend this in October, so don't send me any cards or letters. But if I walk into the booth and I'm feeling good about the president and I'm going to vote for the president, I check that box. I probably vote for Republicans until I run into either a Republican I don't like or a Democrat I particularly do like. And at some point, ballot fatigue takes over. And I either stop voting or I pick and choose my way down. I think the main factor in a year like this, the strongest wind, the strongest variable is, how are people feeling about the presidential candidate from your party?
Yeah. Juan Carlos Cerda has a great question that we all have on our minds these days. There will be a significant leadership void in the House, in the Texas House. And what do you look in your crystal ball there, Ross? And what do you see coming up there?
This is interesting. We're right where we were 2 years ago. We were all wondering who was going to be Speaker of the House when Joe Strauss left. We had some people jockeying for position. They were openly jockeying because we knew Strauss was leaving and because Strauss wasn't in a particularly punitive mode of departure. I mean, he was, ready to move on to the next thing. This is different. After the end of the legislative session last year, Dennis Bonnen had kind of an infamous meeting with a political activist named Michael Quinn Sullivan, some of you know, and seemed in that conversation, it was taped, he seemed in that conversation to offer up some of his fellow Republicans as fodder for the election. It was, within the House, it broke all the rules. I'll put it that way. He was very quickly, it was very quickly evident inside the House that he was not going to be the leader of the House again. And in fact, he didn't put himself on the ballot for this election. So he won't be back in January. Somebody else will be elected Speaker. But we're in a mode right now where Bonnen's in a leadership position at a time when people are looking, as I said earlier, at the executives and the people at the top of places like the Senate and the House, and nobody wants to jump up and get in his way, and nobody particularly wants to be in a position of taking responsibility at the moment for what's going on with the coronavirus. So I think it's going to be a relatively quiet race for Speaker, right up until the election. And then that open field area between the November election and the beginning of the session on the second Tuesday of January is going to be a heck of a Speaker's race. Depending on who's here, I would expect some of the same candidates that we saw last time. I would expect a couple of, new ones, but it depends in great measure on what happens in the election. I should also say here that the Democrats are hopeful that they can take a majority in the House. They have to win 9 seats to do it. There are 2 ways to put this. They came within 9 seats last time is one way to put it, and that's how you'll hear it from one of the Democratic leaders, and they, keep our momentum going. The other way to put it is the best election that they've had in years and years and years left them short of the watermark. So we'll see how they do. If the Democrats win, then we're going to look at a whole different set of candidates. We're going to be looking at Democrats. And, for the first time since Pete Laney was the Speaker back, at the turn of the century. Makes me sound old when I say that. The other possibility, and this is the kind of thing that, journalists are in some way, political journalists are fight promoters. And, we came very close to a split House in the 2007 election or 2008 election with 76 Republicans and 74 Democrats. And you got a coalition out of that. And, that's where Joe Strauss came from. And I think that the chances this time are high that the difference between the number of Republicans and the number of Democrats in the House is close enough that neither party can elect a Speaker without the help of at least some people from the other party. You're going to have enough, even if I'm a Republican in a Republican House, I'm going to have enough, a half dozen or dozen people who just don't like me for some reason, or whose bill I killed or whatever it is. And I'm going to have to supplement with Democrats. Likewise, in a slightly Democratic House, same thing. You're going to have the Democrats are in the minority right now, and it disguises the factionalism inside the Democratic Party inside the House. We're well aware of it in the House Republicans because they're the majority. But if you put the Democrats in a majority, you're going to see factions just like you see them with the Republicans. A Democratic Speaker is going to need some Republican votes.
Yeah. Carrie Tassopoulos from SunWest Communications has a couple of questions. Carrie, I particularly like the one about the running mate. Why don't you ask that question, Carrie?
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Yes.
Ken and Jeff, thanks for hosting this. And Ross, thank you very much for being on. Let's do the presidential race first. Who do you predict that Biden will choose as his running mate, but who should he choose if he wants to maximize the chances that he will be elected? And then let me go ahead. You want me to ask the second one now?
Sure,
Yeah, the second one is, recently I've seen a couple of publications come out from Senator Cruz's office, and what struck me was his reference to 2 bipartisan efforts with Democratic senators, and it raised the question of what is he positioning himself for as we go into the next decade? Thank you.
The first question is, you're asking for prognostication from a guy who thought Jeb Bush was clearly going to be the Republican nominee in 2016. So what do I know? I can tell you the arguments. I think the first question that Joe Biden has to answer, frankly, is what happens if you die? What's the vice president going to be like? There's enough question, and I think there's going to be enough question raised by the Republicans about his health and about, is he too old? This is the turnabout for, the Walter Mondale questions of Ronald Reagan's age. But, one of the questions is going to be, if you don't make it, this vice president is more important than just whoever's going to live over in Annapolis. This may be the next president. What do we think about that? I think that, every time a president chooses a vice president, they are filling a hole in their resume. So, Ronald Reagan needed Washington experience. Even though he'd been feuding with George H.W. Bush, that was the Washington experience. George H.W. Bush needed youth, so he went to Dan Quayle. Bill Clinton needed Washington. He went to Gore. You see how this goes. Barack Obama needed somebody with Washington experience. Donald Trump needed somebody who knew his way around Congress. So Joe Biden's first thing, I think, is going to be, if I had to judge it today, I would say, who would be able to step into the Oval Office if you didn't? But the first thing that everybody asks when they're, or the first consideration of anybody who's running for president on a vice president is who, A, doesn't hurt my ticket, and B, helps my ticket. In this environment, I think, you can make a case that people are looking for politicians who do stuff instead of politicians who say stuff. You're looking for somebody who's going to roll up their sleeves and attack these problems. That's just sort of the vibe of the place right now. You're looking for somebody who's the opposite of Donald Trump, which is probably why Joe Biden has done as well as he has. His selling point, if there is one, is that this is a Democrat that a moderate Republican and certainly a conservative Democrat can vote for. You're not way out on the wing of the party. And, you recenter the party and go forward like that. You can put together a majority that way. I don't know if that'll work, but that's one of the theories. Pick a vice president who doesn't mess that up. That makes Elizabeth Warren or someone like that a difficult choice. You might bring the Bernies in, but scare all those moderates out. So you have to do you've got to do all those kind of political tricks. I think, he said it's going to be a woman. I think it probably has to be a woman to hold his coalition together. I think that'll pull, some votes at least, depending on who that woman is. That'll pull some votes that might ordinarily go to a Republican in a race like this. So, I'm kind of watching the Amy Klobuchars of the world, maybe Kamala Harris,
right?
Maybe the Michigan governor, and
Whitmer.
never discount wild cards.
Yeah, thank you. And then the second question
did I skate
was about,
successfully on that? Yeah.
yeah, you did a great job. And then the second question was about Cruz. Senator Cruz.
Yeah, I think this is the roll up your sleeves argument. I think Cruz is in a mode right now where this isn't when you're looking necessarily. This is an argument that I've heard from some of those guys. I think voters aren't looking for the best partisan right now. They're looking for somebody who can help things out. And the fastest way to get out of a partisan mode is to grab somebody from the other side who's trying to do the same thing and roll up your sleeves and go to work. They're also looking at the, politicians are, at least medium-sided, if not far-sighted. And I think they're looking down the road at the next Congress and thinking, if I'm going to be an effective member of the next Congress, I'm going to have to be able to deal with the other party. It's a little bit of the dynamic I was talking about in the Texas speaker's race. The houses are going to be closely enough balanced that a lot of times you're not going to be able to do it with just Republicans or just Democrats. You're going to have to play across the line. And I think, Cruz, if you like him or don't like him, I've known him for a long time. I knew him before he ran for office. He has a strategic mind. He's really smart about this stuff. And he's not one of those people who plays checkers. He plays chess.
Great.
Ross, we've got several potentially competitive U.S. Congress House races up in the North Dallas area, in Texas 24 and Texas 32. Can you handicap those for us right now?
Yeah, the way the year is going right now, if you stay in the mode that we're in right now, I think it's generally good for incumbents. I think, the sort of the stay the course idea is in there, but it's not as powerful as the inability of a challenger to get enough attention to take down an incumbent. If you're a member of Congress, you can raise money more easily. You can, put U.S. rep in front of your name on your signs. You can do all of those things that are an advantage to some extent in any election. They're a particular advantage in an election when the challengers have to jump up and down like crazy to get any attention. They've got to get past a presidential race. They've got to get past a pandemic. They might have to get past oil prices if this thing is sustained over a period of time. It may be that in October, our entire conversation is about something we're not talking about right now, like are the kids in school? I don't know what the environment's going to be, but to the extent that it's noisy, that is a noisy environment is better for incumbents than for challengers. So the Colin Allred race, I think probably, if you're just betting, I would just generally bet on the incumbents. But some of these challenges are interesting, and some of these Republicans, may have enough money to actually break through and wave their hand in front of some voters. If you're trying to knock off a freshman, there's two ways to look at this. A sophomore election is the hardest election to run because you're an incumbent. You've got some advantages, but you're not a known incumbent. You haven't been up there very long. In some ways, that's your weakest point as an incumbent. And then the other one is, voters were just in a mood in 2018 and they're out of that mood in 2020. That can be hard on a seat that flipped. But I think now I would probably handicap it in favor of the incumbents in both those races.
All right, we're coming to the conclusion here. Didn't get to several questions that Juan Carlos had and several others, but listen, Ross, we can't thank you enough. I'm going to ask one last question. And so it's January 12th, 2021, first day of the Texas legislative session. Mm-hmm. Who's the president of the United States? And who's the U.S. senator that's up for re-election? And what party will have a majority in each of the houses in Texas?
I'm going to grab something. Hang on a sec. Crystal ball. The only honest answer to that is I don't know. But I tend to, unless they have really screwed up or the election, if the coronavirus thing has not gone well and people blame the president, then you're going to get a turn over the apple cart election. If we're not situated on election day like we are now, then I tend to bet on incumbents. I think Cornyn is probably okay. This is a red state. He hasn't, he doesn't have a mark on him in a particular thing. If somebody really doesn't like him and you say, why don't you like him? It's generally partisan stuff and not, well, he did that one thing. I would bet that way. I can always think of a million reasons why anybody in a race could win a race. In Cornyn's race in particular, he's running against two people who've never been on a statewide ballot and most voters have never seen or heard of. So I think, he's in a pretty good race that way. The Trump thing is really, we asked two questions on our polls. And by the way, we have a poll coming out at the end of the week, so watch for that. The first question we ask is, are you going to vote for this guy again or not? It's the Trump versus Trump question. And in our past polls, that's been a 50-50 proposition in Texas, which is not a great position for a Republican president in a red state. And then you say, well, what if when you plug in a name, then the numbers change a little bit. What if it was, so-and-so? What if you're running against Ross Ramsey? It's like, well, 80% Trump. What if you're running against Joe Biden? And right now, I think, that has been a fairly even proposition, but with the president slightly in the lead. So, like I said, I think it's still probably a red state. But this is such a volatile political environment, no less volatile, and for the same reasons as the economic environment and the public health environment. It's really, really hard to make a prediction about what voters are going to do in 7 months and then what the legislature is going to do. And one other thing I would add to my prediction on January 12th of next year is I don't think it's a majority chance, but I think there's a chance that the Texas legislature meets without going to the Capitol. If we're still battling this disease and we've got this going on, they may be, pantsless representatives sitting in their homes voting on their laptops.
Wow. Amazing. Ross, we simply can't thank you enough. You're a treasured asset in this state and beyond. We really appreciate you spending time with us today. Just on behalf of the North Dallas Chamber of Commerce, we'll be making a contribution in your name to the North Texas Food Bank. Thanking you for being here and being part of this. We appreciate it.
Thank you guys
very
for having
much.
me. Holler if I can ever help.
Well, we would appreciate it, and you're always there whenever we need you, so we appreciate that. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I want to thank again our sponsors of the Middle Market Executive Forum Series, Bill Siegel and Coles and Thompson, Tina Young, who's been on this call, and Market Wave, Rachel Capps and Capital One Bank, Higginbotham, represented by Rob Causey, and the Dallas Business Journal, Ali Chandhok. And we really appreciate everyone's engagement in the community, your interest in these programs. Jeff Kittner posted in the chat function our next event, which will be on Friday, that will feature Dr. Phil Wong, who is the Dallas County Medical Director, and Dr. Trish Pearl, who's the head of infectious diseases at UT Southwestern. And they'll be talking about the COVID epidemic and the impact on the community in general, and giving us the latest updates on what's happening here within Dallas County. So with that, we thank you again for being here. Thank you, Ross, and I hope you all have a great day and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks.
And Ken, we will leave this line open for people to network for the next few minutes.
Yes, thank you. Forgot to mention that. Thank you very much.
And Ross, if you can stick, or if you're able to, Liz Morris had a very quick question that she wanted to ask. Liz Morris from RISD.
She's a very dangerous person, but I'll take it.
Yes, she is.
Hey, I am not. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the Coop and Ramos race.
It's that sophomore thing. Coop has an advantage in that race as a challenger, in that she's known. She was on city council. She served in the legislature. So she's got, a name with those voters. And that's actually going to be one of those races where you find out to what extent was 2018 a mood, and to what extent do people snap back if they snap back. I also think it's one of those races that's, heavily dependent on how the top of the ballot does. Linda Coop does better if Trump does better, Ramos does better, if Biden does better. So that's actually a good petri dish in some ways.
Okay, I don't have any idea, but they serve my district, and I'm very interested in who will represent us there.
Yeah, watch your mailbox.
Oh, I will.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else have anything that they'd like to ask Ross real quickly as an aside?
Ross, I live in 114 with John Turner.
Uh-huh.
Do you think he has any danger with his challenger, or do you think he's pretty safe?
Sophomore again, but, I think he's probably pretty safe. He's pretty diligent about that district. I think he's going to be probably okay. But it's one of those things where he is going to be dependent on what happens at the top of the ticket. And that is a district that in a given year could go either way.
Yeah, for sure. We have a couple of other North Dallas Chamber of Commerce board members that are on the call right now as well. We've got Greg White, who's the general manager of the Weston Galleria, and also very active in the Visit Dallas, on the Visit Dallas board. We have Dev Rastogi from AECOM, and I did see someone else, but they just dropped off. Oh, CC Gassner from Texas A&M Commerce. But in any event, Greg or Dev or anybody else have any other comments or questions? Everybody's muted.
Nice job. Appreciate it.
Right. You bet.
Nice.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, I have one question, Ken. In the North Texas, the influx of Californians, businesses like Toyota, do you see that as changing the demographics much?
Yeah, but it's hard to tell what the politics of it are. Do people, I think people probably move for economics and not for politics. I don't have any, personal friends who, a couple of friends that are, a little bit off, who, got tired of the politics here or really wanted to go to the politics there. But most people move for jobs and move for, they think their family's going to do better, or they think they're going to do better, or, this is the track that they're on. And I think they make their way into the kinds of communities that they were probably in before. I mean, there's been a lot written about our tendency to go live in places where people tend to think and look like us. And, you know, I think the Californians in Collin County are as likely to be, you know, conservatives as the people who were there to meet them. There's a theory out there that I've never seen, you know, any factual basis for, that, you know, all these Californians are coming. California is a blue state. Everybody from there is a blue meanie, and they're going to come over here and turn the state Democratic. I really don't think that's how it works.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey,
Deb,
Ross,
did you have a question?
yeah, I do. I was finally able to get myself off of mute. Ross, thanks for a great Q&A session. I'm
Sure.
just curious the impact of the stimulus dollars. You know, everybody's focused on economic recovery. How do you think that's going to play into the election in November?
You know, it depends on when you got a check, whose name was on it, I guess, and what the state of the economy is. You know, after the 2008 crash, the first budget that the Texas legislature wrote after that crash was actually not a bad budget, because we had a bunch of federal stimulus money that was sent into the state to help the state get through the effects of that crash. The budget the next time was terrible. In 2011, when they wrote a budget, they didn't have the federal stimulus money, but they still had, you know, this mismatch of spending and revenue, and that turned into a real mess. If the Texas candidates on the ballot this time are going into a budget where they have to tell voters, we're going to cut education, we're going to cut this, it's going to be really bad, that's different than going in and saying, you know, the federal government has sent us enough money that the state's going to be okay. So that's one level of stimulus. The second level of stimulus, and the more important one, is how are voters doing personally? And if our unemployment claims right now are an indication, you know, there are going to be a lot of people hurting. There are going to be a lot of people, you know, in some form of financial distress, and financial distress is not good for incumbent politicians. So as a political matter, if people are stressed, then the incumbents are going to have a hard time. And how much stimulus money and the timing of its delivery is going to play, you know, I think a fairly large part in how you answer that question.
One other follow-up, if you don't mind. So
Sure.
Obviously we have to have a balanced budget in Texas, right? And so
Right.
again, I'm just looking at, in the past, stimulus money at the federal level required matching funds. And although, you know, we hear that may not be the case, but especially with the oil and gas situation, I'm just curious whether you think there's going to be any appetite to go to figure out a way to go negative with our budget or have a deficit is that even possible?
It is possible. I don't see any appetite for it. It's a Republican legislature in a red state, and I think the minute you misbalanced the books, you'd be, you know, staring at electoral doom. I just don't think they'll do that. The stimulus money after the 2008 thing did not require matching funds, but there are a lot of federal programs that do require matching funds. The biggest example, and the one most frequently given, is Medicaid expansion. And if you wanted to expand Medicaid in Texas, this government hasn't wanted to. It's like a magic Coke machine. You put in a dime and you get out $1. The question has always been, if Texas or states that size opt in, will the federal government pull out and not send the money, but leave the obligations from the money in place? And so that's been enough to keep the Texas Republicans in particular from expanding Medicaid. But you look at a situation like we have now, and the renewed argument on this is that we've stressed our medical and our hospitals and all of that, and that's what this money is for. Let's throw in and do a Medicaid expansion and help ourselves with the budget, help ourselves with the coronavirus, and on down the line. But those objections are pretty well embedded in the Texas Republican Party, and I think it'd be a heavy lift to get that sold in the legislature, even in a time of financial duress.
Great, thanks so much.
Sure.
Anybody else have any questions or comments? Juan
Yeah.
Carlos?
If there's time, Ross, So when the Great Depression happened, that changed a lot of politics. It led to things like some of the Works Progress Administration programs and Social Security. Do you see this type of policy upheaval happening as a result of this economic crisis as well?
It's hard to say 6 weeks into the crisis. If it depends, depends a lot on the duration of this thing, and how people are doing as you go down the line. I mean, like I was saying a minute ago on the political question, if people are still hurting in October and September, one of the questions that they're going to be asking people who want to get elected is, what are you going to do about this? What's your solution to this? And that's when some things like that might come in. But those kinds of structural changes take some time. An example of this is the situation with oil right now. The May delivery price, as you guys all know, went to $37 negative yesterday, but the June price was still $21 or $22 positive. So which one are you betting on? And, which future are you planning for? And I think there's a million questions like that when you're, especially when you're talking about restructuring government programs and such. There has been some writing and thinking about, are we entering a new period where people look to government for solutions to problems like this? And as of, 1:15 and 1:17 on Tuesday, yeah, it looks that way right now. But like I said, we're only 6 weeks into this. And, that gas that I put in my car on March 3rd is still in my car. Ask me on the second or third tank.
Thank you.